In this lecture, we have the absolute pleasure of looking at Post-Impressionism, which is as the name of the style is suggesting. This is a style that is happening after Impressionism. In many ways, Post-Impressionism is an extension of some of the ideas of Impressionism, but many scholars feel uncomfortable with this term Post-Impressionism because they find it too limiting, that it casts the style as kind of myopic, where there really was quite a few different diverse approaches that the post-impressionists took when they're making their art. Now, we are going to concentrate on two of these approaches in this lecture. One, the analytical approach, and two, the emotional approach. And this emotional approach is more appropriately referred to as the symbolist approach. It's characterized as much more emotional and imaginative, with works of art that have highly personal meanings to the artist. Now we're going to start with Georges Seurat, whose work is characterized as falling within the analytical approach. Now we know that the effects of light and color was something that the Impressionists were exploring as a way to capture a moment in time. Remember Monet's haystack paintings? The analytical post-impressionists were also looking at light and color, but the difference is that they are taking a more scientific approach, particularly as it pertains to color. And this more scientific approach is occurring against the backdrop of other developments in science during this time, namely chemistry, physics, and psychology. With analytical post-impressionists, they were not simply looking at color, but they were also analyzing other formal qualities of painting, such as space, which is something we will really see quite clearly in the next slide. Now, what is also reminiscent of the Impressionist style is the subject matter, modern urban life, where here Seurat depicts the leisurely activities of Parisians in an outdoor area that was on the outskirts of Paris. But take a close look at the people. They're not really interacting with one another very much. And again, no one's interacting with us. So again, it's that Impressionist focus on alienation, which I think is emphasized by the fact that this scene feels so quiet. You would think there would be a sense of vibrancy, considering there's so many people that are populating the space, but we don't quite get that feeling. Now, the true difference between this work and something out of Impressionism is that the handling is entirely different. This work is much more structured in terms of its composition, where we're getting a sense of perspective. It's not as flat as some Impressionist works tend to be, but even more so, the brushwork. Here it is highly controlled, replacing what we saw previously, which was that unblended, sort of sketchy approach. Here, Seurat's intellectual approach is very different from that spontaneous quality of Impressionist painting. Seurat was an avid reader of color theory and the science of optics, and he explored the concept of these by applying small dots of pure color in a technique known as pointillism. Now, it's also been referred to as divisionism, but I really like the term pointillism better because it's going to be easier for you to remember. Because the technique of pointillism literally involves thousands of points or dots. Seurat believed that these points of color were mixed optically by the eye, that you didn't have to mix them with the brush. So what he would do is he would set these little points of painting, these little dots of paint, one next to the other, and the eye looks at it, and it looks like one coherent piece. It's a great idea in theory, but it really only works from a specific vantage point, where you really can only make sense of the piece visually if you're standing from a certain distance. So if you actually went up close to this painting, looked up really, really close, these images wouldn't be quite as crisp and clear. They kind of would look pixelated, or for those of you who are older, remember those like old-fashioned TVs, which you never should have done this, but you look like super close at the screen and you see like yellow, blue, and red dots. That's what this kind of looks like up close. Now here we have the artist Paul Cézanne, and he's well known for his unique studies of nature and color, and this also then would place his work within this analytical approach. Seurat, who we saw in the previous slide, is using painting to analyze color. Cézanne is using painting to analyze shape and space. For Cézanne, the aim was not a naturalistic recording of nature, but was instead an exploration of the form, the color, the structure of the painting itself. The work was more about the formal aspects of the work rather than the subject matter. So what he's really doing here is he's making a painting about painting. It's not about landscape. It's not about Mont Sainte-Victoire. This mountain really is just the vehicle for this exercise of analyzing the practice of painting. Now this alone is super significant, and it might not seem so. It might seem kind of silly to paint about paint. But this foreshadows what will become increasingly intellectual in the way that some artists will approach art making, where we're going to see more and more artists as we move into modern art looking at making art about art. Now this is something that had never really been done before. So Cézanne is opening up this whole new set of concepts for artists to explore. So important. Now this idea of painting about painting has sort of been done before, right? Don't forget about Monet, who was the one who really paved the way for the trailblazer known as Cézanne, who, by the way, did not receive trailblazer status until after the fact. During his life, Cézanne's work received zero critical acclaim. Nobody liked it. They thought it was childish. But don't feel too sad. Cézanne is looking down from the afterlife, now knowing that Professor Brandel Andrus is doing her part to let people know that he is one of the most important painters of all time, after Giotto, of course. With Monet's Haystacks, we see that he was really looking more at the transitory visual effects of atmosphere, how this changes over time. He's conveying that through the nuances in light and color. The difference is Cézanne is going beyond this, and he's considering the placement of lines, spatial planes, and colors. It's this approach that earns Cézanne the accolade of creating one of the very first true abstract works of art in the history of modern art. Wow, that is major. Let's sing the praises a bit more of Cézanne, because I really cannot emphasize enough how important Cézanne was to the development of modern art. This is what we are really seeing here, okay? We are seeing abstracted images that are broken down to geometric planes of shape. Cézanne had advocated for treating nature geometrically, and I quote, he says, by means of the cylinder, the sphere, and the cone. So by treating his subject as such in such a geometricized fashion, what he's doing is he's creating a condensed flat space as a means to analyze how shape and space operate within a two-dimensional work of art. Now guess what I just did? I just used the same exact description that defines cubist works of art. So you know what this means? It means really that the first true cubist was Cézanne, not Pablo Picasso. Because you know what? Picasso gets all this credit for being this like vanguard of modern art when all he really did was copy everybody else's ideas. Now I'm going to go ahead and stop myself here, or else the rest of this online lecture is going to be me going off on how much I dislike Picasso, and I'd like to go ahead and save that rant for the Cubist lecture. We'll instead move on to Vincent van Gogh, another post-impressionist painter. Now, while Seurat and Cézanne were taking Impressionism in this more analytical, scientific direction, Van Gogh is taking Impressionism to a much more emotional, expressive place, which positions his work as this symbolist approach to post-impressionism that I had mentioned at the beginning of this lecture. Here we have a super famous Starry Night, which is this compelling nocturnal landscape that feels alive, a vista of teeming energy filled with whirling stars and galaxies, with humanity huddled beneath. Van Gogh was Dutch, and his pieces reflect some of the influence coming from 17th century Dutch landscape painting, which we can see here. This very low horizon line, all the way down here, where you have this dramatic sky that commands the majority of the compositional space. I bet you could guess where the emotional, the symbolist approach is seen in Van Gogh's work. If you guessed color, you would be correct. He was one of the most genius colorists probably in the entire history of art. His color juxtapositions are so unique, they're seemingly arbitrary, but yet they're so very compelling and visually arresting. They're so unorthodox, these choices of color, that some scholars have suggested that Van Gogh actually may have been colorblind. Now, it's the color here that establishes the mood. We certainly don't have the pastels of the Impressionists any longer, but instead what we have here are these intense, warm, cool color contrasts. And he's applying them with this turbulent motion in his brush that really helps to intensify the color. But yet, there's something serene about the color palette too, probably because it's so dominated by cool colors. I cannot emphasize enough how influential this color usage will be moving forward. This idea of using color to express emotion will become one of the cornerstones of the Expressionist style, which is the next style we're going to learn about. Note this in your notes, because when we get to Expressionism, you know I'm going to ask you, have we seen this idea before of color being used to express emotion? And you will be able to say confidently, yes, we have. Right here with Van Gogh and other post-impressionist symbolist painters. And by the way, Van Gogh's highly expressive use of color is only complemented further by his use of the impasto technique. It's a brushwork technique where the paint is built up quite thickly on the surface to create this lovely texture you can see here. And this is really the best I can do. To truly see the impasto stroke, you need to see a Van Gogh in person. And I hope everyone gets the chance to do that. Get as close as you can before you get in trouble by the museum guard to take in this built-up of the texture. Now, before we move on, I want to talk about this idea of Van Gogh being crazy, because I don't like this. Because I think it makes his supposed mental state overshadow the true contributions that he made to art history. When you ask people about Van Gogh, they say, oh, he was crazy. Not, oh, he was the genius colorist of all time, which is really the first thing that anyone should say when they're talking about Van Gogh. Now, scholars absolutely do not understand adequately Van Gogh's emotional issues. Of course he had struggles, we all do, and yes, he did cut off his ear, a portion of it, that is definitely a thing. But he may not have been as crazy, doing the little hand quote marks right here, crazy like people love to imagine. It's been suggested that he had a neurological disorder. Some suggest a severe form of epilepsy, and that's what caused some of his struggles. Some have suggested that his penchant for putting his paintbrushes in his mouth was the problem, because that paintbrush had highly toxic lead paint. Some say he was an alcoholic. Now there's this whole he killed himself narrative, right? But actually there's some pretty compelling evidence out there now that's suggesting that this simply is not true. That he was actually killed by a bunch of hooligans, these bullies. And what would happen is Van Gogh would walk about the streets, and these guys would like bully him and tease him. And one day somebody had a gun, and they were like trying to intimidate him. And the gun actually accidentally went off, shot him in the stomach, and he ended up bleeding out in a super horrible, painful death. If you're going to kill yourself, you're not going to shoot yourself in the stomach and suffer for days on end. I would imagine you would probably do something a little bit more direct. So do me a favor. Don't let people take away our heroes. When people say Van Gogh was crazy and that's why his paintings are so compelling, which I think, by the way, trivializes his creativity and his artistic ability, tell them instead about the fact that he was a total boss painter and a genius colorist. Now we move on to Paul Gauguin, who was another artist who took this emotional symbolist approach to post-impressionist painting. He was particularly well known for his depictions of life in Tahiti. He had moved there in 1891 as a way to escape what he saw as the materialism of Europe. He was hoping to reconnect with nature, and when he got there, he was devastated to discover that Tahiti had been colonized. What Gauguin was trying to do was, using his words, search for the savage. And this is really what is, in my mind, casting him as one of the villains of art history. This is so problematic. Think about this word savage and what this means, what ideas this is referring to. This idea of being uncivilized, wild, animalistic. And Gauguin is using this term to describe the people of Tahiti. In much of his artwork, he sought out the savage through the use of invented non-European imagery and his own personal fetishized views, his fantasies of what life in Tahiti should be like, not life in what Tahiti actually was like. He tried to maintain his vision of an untamed paradise that was teeming with primitive life, that really did counteract what was the colonial realities. In this work, and in other works, you can see his attempt to preserve this non-existent ideal that he had in his mind. Here we see this in the depiction of native motifs, which we're seeing primarily back right in here, which, by the way, this isn't even accurate. Basically what he did is he made up what he imagined to be Tahitian religious imagery from photographs that he had seen of Egyptian and Buddhist sculpture. So basically what he's doing is he's superimposing his own ideas on what he thinks the sacred religious imagery of other cultures should be. And I don't know, I think that's a problem. He tries to suggest this untamed jungle with bright harmonies of warm colors to suggest the heat, the humidity of the tropics. The color is similar to that of Van Gogh, where its application is seemingly arbitrary, in which both artists are rejecting the more naturalistic color approaches that we saw typically employed by the Impressionists. Gauguin also uses a lot of natural elements, and in his fantasies, Tahiti was this place with all of these sexually available women who were there for the taking, which he shows us here with these partially undressed women, right? Whose body positions tantalizingly suggest their availability. It's kind of alluring looks that they give the viewer. Now, life in Tahiti was hard for Gauguin. Obviously, he's living according to a fantasy that doesn't even exist. However, also, his health was poor. If I recall correctly, he had contracted syphilis. His work was not well received, and he was pretty sad about this colonial situation. So he decided to kill himself, and this was the last work he was going to make before killing himself. And you get a sense of where Gauguin's at with this work, psychologically, emotionally. It's this very pessimistic image of life's cycle, where aging and death are inevitable, where we see this range in age from little babies, right down in here, to the elderly. Death is inevitable. The end. And by the way, the suicide attempt was unsuccessful, and Gauguin lived to see another day. Now we'll finish up this lecture by looking at a sculpture that most art historians characterize as post-impressionist in its style, by the artist Rodin. His expressive approach to sculpture has proved to be highly influential to subsequent sculptors. We can see in this work that's in line with the Impressionist sculptor Degas' rough handling of form, again creating these deliberately unfinished artworks that were considered a deviation from classical tradition, which had advocated for the works to be finished with this smooth skin, balanced, creating these idealized depictions of people, which this really doesn't do any of those three. This work was made to commemorate an event that occurred during the 100 Years' War, when the King of England had captured the city of Calais in France and offered to spare the city if the 6 leading citizens, dressed only in sackcloth, would surrender themselves willingly for execution. Rodin shows the 6 volunteers here marching out to what they assume will be their deaths. In the end, they don't get put to death, but they don't know this yet at this point. He uses, Rodin, the heaviness of the bronze medium to show the weight of the self-sacrifice. The bulk and strength of the material shows the fortitude that would be required for one, I think, really to willingly walk towards one's own death. But those who commissioned the artwork were not pleased with the results that you see here. They felt these men were too ordinary looking, rather than being depicted as idealized heroes. Instead of showing a calm bravery, they were shown at varying stages of acceptance and despair, like this guy, so expressive, putting his arm up and grief, probably in fear as well. It's that same sort of psychological complexity that we saw with Impressionist painting. The patrons were also not pleased with Rodin's plan to display the group close to the ground level, as we see here, rather than what we would typically anticipate, which would be the placement of heroic figures elevated up on a pedestal, which would suggest that their actions were higher, they were superior. But Rodin wanted to place them at ground level to communicate to viewers that ordinary people are capable of noble acts. And it also, by placing them on ground level, allowed for the viewer, the everyman, to be able to directly interact with the sculpture because of this shared spatial plane.